I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the brand. The morning air was thick with the scent of damp hay and turned earth as I leaned against the fence, surveying my cattle like I did every day. I was expecting the usual, nothing but slow, chews and lazy tail flicks. Instead, I saw it, a fresh burn seared into the hide of one of my best heifers. Not my brand, not a rancher's brand at all. It was a crude, ugly thing. 3 letters, sharp and blocky. HOA. My stomach turned, but not from confusion, from fury. I knew exactly who was behind this. Margaret Langley, president of the Hickory Bend Homeowners Association, self-proclaimed guardian of neighborhood standards, and a woman with the moral flexibility of a rattlesnake in a chicken coop. She had terrorized the folks in this community for years with her endless rules, fines, and absurd mandates. But this was a new level of insanity. I clenched my fists, feeling the heat rise in my chest as I marched toward my truck. She had no idea what she'd just done. Hickory Bend wasn't always like this. It used to be a peaceful little community on the outskirts of town. Some retirees, a few young families, and me, one of the last real ranchers in the county. I had my land long before Hickory Bend was even a thought. But over the years, as new developments sprouted up, so did the HOA. Margaret Langley took the presidency 5 years ago, and since then, it had been a downhill slide into bureaucratic hell. It started small. Mailbox colors had to match a community-approved palette. Holiday decorations had to be tasteful, and grass couldn't be over 3 inches tall. Then it got worse. She fined a widow for having wind chimes that were too loud. She tried to ban work trucks from driveways, a rule that conveniently didn't apply to her son-in-law's landscaping business. And when old Mr. Turner put up a small flagpole for his late son's military service, Margaret threatened to have it ripped out. She did it all with a polite, icy smile and a thinly veiled sense of glee. And now, she had branded my cattle. I pulled into her pristine, over-landscaped driveway, my tires grinding over her stupid white gravel. I didn't bother knocking. I just pushed open the door of the HOA office where Margaret sat like a queen behind her oversized mahogany desk. Her blonde bob was as stiff as her posture, and her eyes flicked up from a clipboard as if I were a mild inconvenience instead of a man ready to burn her entire operation to the ground. "Ah, Mr. Calloway," she said smoothly, folding her hands. "What can I do for you?" I slapped a printed photo of the brand onto her desk. "You want to explain this?" Her gaze barely flickered. "Oh, that. Yes, I had some of the neighborhood volunteers take care of it." She said it so casually, as if defacing my cattle was the same as planting new flowers in the median. I felt my pulse hammer in my ears. "You had volunteers, random people from this neighborhood, walk onto my land and burn an HOA brand into my cattle?" Margaret smiled in that way she did when she thought she was being charming. "I assumed you would be grateful. Your cattle were, well, let's just say they needed a little help to meet community aesthetic standards." I stared at her. Community aesthetic standards? Well, you know how important curb appeal is. She waved a manicured hand. "We have guidelines, Mr. Calloway. We can't just have unkempt livestock ruining the integrity of our community. It sends the wrong message." I could feel my teeth grinding. "Margaret, you don't own my land. You don't own my cattle." She blinked, slow and condescending. "Oh, but you're within the Hickory Bend jurisdiction." I laughed, a low, humorless sound. "Jurisdiction?" She nodded, flipping open a binder thick enough to club a man to death. "As per the new HOA amendment, any livestock visible from a public road falls under the purview of our beautification policies." I felt my blood turn to fire. "You can't just rewrite laws to suit yourself." "Oh, but I can." She smiled, smug, satisfied. This was her kingdom, and I was just another subject expected to bow. I leaned forward, planting my hands on her desk. "Let me tell you something, Margaret," I said, voice low and steady. "You didn't just overstep. You broke the law." She tilted her head, lips pursing in faux concern. "Oh, is that so?" "Yes." I straightened, my chest rising with the sheer force of my anger. "Because I'm not just a rancher, Margaret. I'm the goddamn livestock commissioner." For the first time, something flickered in her expression, just for a second, a tiny fracture in that smug, self-assured veneer. Then it was gone. "Well," she said smoothly, flipping a page in her binder, "I suppose we'll just have to let the legal system decide." That was when I knew. She actually believed she could win. She thought she was untouchable. 2 days later, the fines started coming in. Margaret was doubling down. First, I got a notice for livestock-related disturbances. Then, a fine for failing to maintain the scenic integrity of the community. Then, things got worse. A letter from an HOA hired attorney arrived, warning me that my cattle were creating an environmental nuisance and that further non-compliance would result in legal action. Margaret was coming for me, and she wasn't stopping. But here's the thing about power-hungry bureaucrats. They always push too far. And Margaret Langley had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She branded my cattle thinking it was some cute little display of dominance. What she didn't realize? That's a felony. Branding livestock that doesn't belong to you isn't just vandalism, it's criminal tampering with registered property. In Texas, that could land you in prison. Margaret Langley thought she could twist HOA rules to suit her little kingdom. She had no idea she had just stepped into my jurisdiction, but I didn't move too fast. Margaret was the kind of woman who expected resistance. She thrived on it. People yelling, arguing, threatening legal action. That was just another Tuesday for her. She had lawyers, she had loopholes. She had the kind of smug suburban self-assurance that made her feel untouchable. I couldn't just fight her. I had to let her dig her own grave. The next week was a war of attrition. Margaret sent another fine in the mail, this one for failure to adhere to the neighborhood's visual standards. Apparently, cattle standing in a field violated some kind of unwritten aesthetic principle that she had just invented. 2 days later, an official HOA inspector showed up, some scrawny guy in khakis and a polo, clipboard in hand, squinting at my land like it was a condemned property. "You're in violation," he announced, snapping a picture of my fence. I leaned against the gate, arms crossed. "Violation of what exactly?" He hesitated, flipped through his clipboard. I could smell the uncertainty on him. The land use guidelines," he tried. I just stared. He cleared his throat. "It says right here that outdoor structures must be in harmony with the neighborhood's approved visual profile." I glanced at my barn. Red, wooden, hadn't changed in 40 years. I looked back at him. "And? Well," he flipped another page. "It's too rustic." I actually laughed. "Too rustic? I'm a rancher." He shifted awkwardly. "I don't write the rules, sir." "No, you just let Margaret shove them down everyone's throat." The guy had enough sense to look uncomfortable, but that didn't stop him from stapling a violation notice to my fence before he scurried back to his HOA-issued SUV. Margaret was tightening her grip. And the rest of Hickory Bend? They were falling in line. Mrs. Allen, who had lived here for over 30 years, stopped me at the gas station. "I'm so sorry, Jake," she murmured, glancing around like Margaret had spies in the aisles. "She's got everyone terrified," I said. She nodded, voice low. "She fined the Holloways $300 for having a bird feeder." I swore under my breath. "She's out of control," Mrs. Allen said, "but no one wants to fight her. We all saw what happened to Tom." Tom Pearson had gone against Margaret last year. His crime? Leaving his Christmas lights up 2 weeks past New Year's. Margaret had buried him in fines. Then she dragged his name through every HOA newsletter, calling him a community detractor. By spring, he'd sold his house. Margaret ruled through fear. But fear has a tipping point, and I could feel it coming. The next escalation was predictable. A letter, official, legal. This time from a real lawyer. Margaret had escalated the fight. It accused me of willful non-compliance and claimed my property, was lowering neighborhood values. If I didn't bring my land up to approved standards, the HOA would pursue a civil case. She was trying to sue me into submission. I exhaled, slow and controlled, gripping the letter so tightly the paper warped under my fingers. Margaret was betting I'd cave under pressure. What she didn't realize, I had more power than she knew. I walked into the HOA office that afternoon, letter in hand. Margaret was behind her desk, sipping organic lemon water like she hadn't just threatened to drag me through court. "Oh, Mr. Calloway," she said sweetly. "I assume you've come to discuss your—" I dropped the letter onto her desk. She barely glanced at it. "Ah, yes. The official compliance order. I'm afraid it's out of my hands now." I smiled. "Just a little." "Oh, don't worry, Margaret. I'm just here to thank you." She blinked. "Thank me?" I nodded, slow. "You see, I had some colleagues take a look at your little stunt. The branding, the harassment." I leaned in. "And they had some thoughts." Her lips pressed together. I could feel the shift, that first whisper of doubt creeping into her spine. But she wasn't scared. Not yet. That night, things took a turn. I was out by the barn, checking on my cattle, when my security lights flared. Figure stood at the edge of my property. Small, stiff, arms crossed. Margaret, she wasn't smiling. "You think you can intimidate me?" she called. I stepped toward the fence, keeping my posture relaxed. "Margaret, I don't have to intimidate you." Her jaw clenched. "You don't scare me." "Good," I said. "Then you won't mind hearing something interesting." She said nothing. I continued, voice even. "I made a few calls today, and it turns out—" I gave her a meaningful look. Branding cattle without permission isn't just illegal. It's a second-degree felony. She didn't move. I could feel the moment the words hit. She was trying to keep her composure, but I saw the tightness in her shoulders, the way her nails dug into her arms. I took another step forward, lowering my voice. "That means prison time, Margaret. Up to 20 years. And that's before we even talk about fines." Silence. The tension between us was thick enough to cut. Then, something changed. Margaret exhaled sharply, a breath that sounded too much like relief, and then she smirked. "That's very dramatic, Jake," she said, voice light, almost amused. I frowned. Her eyes gleamed. "You think I didn't anticipate this?" she said. "Oh, honey." Her voice turned syrupy sweet. "Let me tell you something. You might have your little title, but I have connections. Lawyers, judges, friends in very high places." I clenched my jaw. She leaned in. "You think you're—" "Playing chess, Mr. Calloway." A slow, confident smile. "But I've already won." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Because the way she said it, the sheer certainty in her voice, it made me wonder, what the hell did she have up her sleeve? Margaret Langley didn't flinch, didn't falter. She stood there, wrapped, in that smug certainty, like a queen surveying a battlefield where the outcome had already been decided. And that chilled me, because Margaret didn't bluff. She didn't threaten unless she thought she could win. I narrowed my eyes. "What did—" "You do?" She exhaled through her nose like she was almost disappointed that I didn't already know. "It's not about what I did, Mr. Calloway. It's about what you won't be able to do." Then she smiled. Checkmate, and she walked away. 2 days later, I found out exactly what she meant. The sheriff showed up at my ranch, not a phone call, not a warning. A full visit. Sheriff Monroe stepped out of his patrol car, thumbs hooked in his belt, his expression caught somewhere between apologetic and grim. "Jake." "Saw your truck," I said. "Figured this was going to be bad news." He sighed, adjusting. His hat. "Got a complaint filed against you." "For what?" "Livestock negligence." I felt my stomach drop. "You've got to be kidding me." Monroe shook his head. "Got a report stating you've been failing to provide adequate food and care to your herd. And since you're technically under Hickory Bend's HOA jurisdiction, they included claims that your property is in violation of—" I swore, loud enough that Monroe winced. This was Margaret's move. I'd been so focused on going after her. For branding my cattle, I hadn't thought about how she'd strike back. This wasn't just an HOA fine. This was a full-on legal complaint. If she could get enough people behind the accusation, it wouldn't just be a hassle, it could cost me my livestock license, which meant everything. Margaret wasn't playing defense anymore. She was trying to destroy me. I knew I had to act fast. I wasn't just going to stop her. I was going to end her. That night I gathered everything I had. Every fine, every letter, every ridiculous violation she'd thrown at the people of Hickory Bend. I made copies. Then I made calls. Because Margaret thought she had connections. But she forgot who I was. She forgot what I had access to. And she had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I walked into the county courthouse with a case so airtight you could have vacuum sealed it. I didn't just file a complaint against Margaret, I filed criminal charges for illegal branding, for livestock tampering, for harassment and fraud under the false guise of HOA authority. And then I went one step further. I contacted the state agricultural board. Margaret thought her power reached everywhere, but the state doesn't give a damn about HOA politics. Once they saw evidence that she was using her HOA to enforce illegal, fraudulent policies, they started digging, and oh boy, was there plenty to find. The fallout came fast. First, the county issued a formal investigation. Then, news broke about Margaret's violations, and that's when things spiraled out of her control. The final nail in the coffin came at the next HOA meeting. The moment she walked in, she knew something was wrong. The usual fearful silence? Gone. Instead, people were talking, whispering. Margaret paused. I saw it. The slight twitch in her jaw, the way she forced her shoulders back, doubling down on the illusion of control. Good evening, she said smoothly, stepping up to the podium. Before we begin, I'd like to address— Sit down, Margaret. The voice came from Tom Pearson. Tom, who had left the neighborhood after she ruined him. Tom, who had come back. Margaret's smile didn't falter. Excuse me? Tom stepped forward, arms crossed. We all know what you did. The murmuring grew. You lied, someone said. You branded his cattle, Margaret. Used HOA money for your own legal fees. Margaret stiffened. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice sharp but not quite steady. And then Monroe stepped in. Sheriff Monroe, with a warrant. Margaret went still. Pure silence. Then Monroe sighed. Margaret Langley, you're under arrest for livestock tampering, fraud, and unlawful enforcement of HOA policies under false legal pretenses. Margaret actually laughed, a small, brittle sound. You can't be serious. Serious as a heart attack, Monroe said. The color drained from her face. This is a mistake, she said. But no one was listening, because Margaret wasn't in charge anymore. The cuffs clicked around her wrists, and for the first time in her life, Margaret Langley had no power, no rules to hide behind, no one to protect her. As Monroe led her away, she turned, wild-eyed, desperate. You think this is over? She hissed. You think you've won? I smiled. I don't think, Margaret. I gestured to the crowd. I know. And she saw it then. The truth. Not just that she'd lost, but that she had nothing left. The community she ruled with fear. They weren't afraid anymore. They were free. Margaret didn't go to prison, not for 20 years at least. She cut a deal. Lessened sentence, but permanently barred from holding any HOA or legal authority. Hickory Bend dissolved the HOA. The bylaws burned. And me? Well, I went back to being a rancher. No fines, no threats, no HOA nonsense, just me and my land. And if you ever drive past Hickory Bend, you'll see my cattle, standing exactly where they belong, with my brand and no one else's.